So good morning, and welcome to all of the participants on the call, to our industry partners, to friends and colleagues, members of the Royal Logistic Corps. A very warm welcome to this first RLC Foundation Winter Seminar of 2022, and a very titled, if I may. Or we might well be witnessing the first chapter of what that new world might look like. You'll understand, I suspect, many on this call, and it's you wish to read and digest, but the basis of the integrated review and the notions of a global Britain being more persistently engaged, being the underpinning theme, is something that you're probably reasonably familiar with. You may not have all saw or have caught up with CDS Admiral Radakin's speech to RUSI, which he made on the 8th of December. But in his inaugural speech, he talked to two dominant themes: a sense of back to the future, with the return of the state as the controlling and dominant feature of the international system. He also talked about a return to the traditional notion of British self-interest in all its guises, defining our policies and the way that we act. He also contended just before Christmas that we'd already pressed the play button on those two themes, and indeed contended that someone had hit the fast forward button. But the state is back with a vengeance, and of course events in Eastern Europe very starkly demonstrate that he was absolutely right with that notion. Now, the one thing that the global pandemic has shown us is the importance of global supply chains to our national self-interest, and indeed to most sovereigns' nations' self-interest. And indeed, supply chain resilience is now a Defence Board risk, Defence Board risk 10, in fact. And there are numerous supply chain resilience measures that are underway across defence. What we're witnessing in global disruption terms, I think will take years to recover from. But what we don't want to do is simply return to the previous state. For we appear to be moving away from globalization and back to a regional supply chain construct. So a notion of back to the future, if you like. Now, many will know, and certainly from industry you will know, but contracting and incentivization is predominantly aligned around price and the product specification being met. And for the last 20 years or so, the drive has been for lower price and cost efficiency, underpinned and facilitated by largely an assumption about the uninterrupted nature and the assured nature of the supply chains itself. Now, it's my view that we need to think about supply chains in future having two modes: a business as usual mode, intended to meet the steady state predictable demand, and where focus is on leanness and cost efficiency. And then an agile mode, which has emphasis on speed, responsiveness, flexibility, and bakes in resilience as a matter of principle. Now, in saying that, we must accept, of course, that resilience costs. And if we want our value chain to have resilience as a prioritization, it is something we've got to consciously consider the cost of. And we'll need to be precise in terms of where we apply our desired outcome of resilience. But what we shouldn't be doing, if we're to step into this brave new world, is simply go back to the old normal. In the adoption of a new normal, as I think we mustn't fall back on the old processes, the infrastructure, the IT systems, and the organization that used to work in the old normal. So to frame us and to frame this discussion, I'm very pleased to welcome two eminent speakers. And first off, who better to remind us that our future is derived from history and the actions we may or may not have taken in the past than Professor Beatrice Heuser. For Professor Heuser holds the chair in international relations at Glasgow University, with degrees from London, Oxford, and Marburg. For over 10 years, she's taught at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, as well as the Sorbonne, St. Denis, and two German universities. She has supported the international staff at NATO headquarters in Brussels and was Director for Research at the Historical Research Office at the Bundeswehr. As you might expect, Professor Beatrice is a published author. She's published works on Clausewitz and the evolution of strategy, and her latest book, War, is due out in March. Our second presenter is someone that will be known to many, Mr. Damon Alexander, now a logistics advisor to Leidos and vice president of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. Damon had an illustrious 27-year career as an RAF logistician, including command of the RAF's deployable engineering and logistic capabilities. Throughout his career, he's held high-profile roles in national and international appointments, building on his expertise in all matters supply chain logistics and strategy formulation. His last role in uniform was head of the Defence Supply Chain and Operational Movements Organisation. On transitioning, Damian became VP and Managing Director of the LCST programme, a £6.2 billion 13-year programme with his aim to transform the commodity purchasing and the logistics services delivery across defence. So I couldn't think of two more highly qualified people to take us through and into this brave new world right now, in terms of what it means for defence, us as logisticians, and for our industry partners. So to the both of you, a very warm welcome, and I thoroughly look forward to what you've got to say.
So let me start with the question of whether the following sounds at all familiar. We have powers upholding the rules-based international system, finding themselves rather challenged by the bullies and the international scene. We have the impression that there are too many building sites, that there are things going on in Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, and in the Far East that could explode in an even worse way than they're already simmering at the moment and already with fighting at the moment. We have some great powers breaking their own treaty commitments not to violate borders by annexing territory, and we have another great power putting the annexation of another state on its to-do list in its big party Congress. We have great powers talking about spheres of influence over the heads of the small powers concerned. We have medium powers seeming willing to negotiate the cession of territory by a small power to a rapacious great power, and we see them basically appeasing a rogue state. We find that each state is out for itself under the banner of sovereignty. What have I been describing? Well, that was the world in the 1930s. The world in the 1930s seemed at first to be an improvement on the world before the First World War, because there was that wonderful League of Nations, but the United States was not in it. Britain and France were the only two members of what the League of Nations had as a similar thing to the Security Council. It did actually have such a thing. It was called the Council. It had some supposedly permanent members, but in fact, the only two members which were in there permanently were Britain and France. A number of other states rotated in and out, and particularly three of them turned into rogue states. And when they were confronted about their acts of aggression and their expansionism, they simply huffed and puffed and left the League of Nations. It was that easy to withdraw. The sixth member of that Security Council that came in rather late was the Soviet Union, but that was at that stage still quite forcibly expansionist and communist. There was, other than this League of Nations, there was no defensive collective alliance. And the rogue states were revisionist, expansionist, and authoritarian. They formed alliances of convenience to keep each other's backs free so that they could make their own expansionist moves in various directions. Why was the world in the interwar years like that? Because there had been some false lessons drawn from the period before. One of the false lessons had been that you must not enter into alliances, that they would entangle you against your interest to get involved in wars that you had no interest in fighting. Hence this avoidance of military alliances in the interwar period in particular. And the Americans actually took this as the lesson to withdraw from Europe altogether. The British lesson was to go back to its old balance of power strategy that it had espoused ever since the 16th century at the very latest, and it even balanced against its fellow democracy France. I find that particularly horrifying. The earliest RAF plans for future war anticipated that France would be the adversary and was thinking about how to bomb the French population into submission as easily as possible. The consequences of this were disastrous because there was simply no power block of rules upholding international powers that was going to confront the three rogue states and that could have really pushed them into a corner. So Germany after Versailles was a revisionist country because it wanted to have the territories back that it had lost, but it also sought great power status. There was one particular additional thing that was peculiar to this period, which was that there were pockets of sympathizers with fascist Germany, fascist Italy, and authoritarian Japan throughout the West. And that was then also manifested itself in the victory of the fascists in Spain. And there were also pockets of communist sympathizers throughout the West, which that's also very important because it meant that there was a fifth column or more, or at least a strong support in all these countries for the respective two extreme sides of the political spectrum. So fascist movements were actually important in all the countries in red, not at equal level, and communist parties were in countries all over Europe as well. So very importantly, the effect of that was that there was appeasement, each state looking out for itself, and Poland even joining in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia at Munich in 1938. And very importantly, he found that they were appeasing the great powers in the hope that they could avoid further expansionism and that they would not be affected. This was not quite, sorry. In the situation we have today is not quite the same, but you have the United States tilting towards the Pacific. You have the United Kingdom having returned to the emphasis on the state, as we've just heard, also in the very big theme in the CDS's talk in December, with its withdrawal from the EU, but also with its own Pacific tilt with the AUKUS Pact with the United States. You have the United Nations Security Council, where you have Britain and France, who were at the time in the 1930s occasionally cooperating, but even now they're usually cooperating there. But you have in that of the threesome of the Western powers in the United Nations Security Council, it's France alone that every now and then tries to push for an autonomous ability to defend itself among the Europeans, of a European pillar in NATO or something like that. We have revisionist, expansionist, and authoritarian states forming alliances of convenience to keep each other's backs free, just like in the 1930s, one can surmise, because the relations between China and Russia are impressively close now. And you do have alliances, unlike in the 1920s and 1930s, but NATO and the EU are greatly weakened by overstretch, and by the fact that each member is looking out for itself in some form. And there's also a continuing fear of world war that might escalate to nuclear war. So that is a consistent pattern that you still find. We do also have small pockets in the West of conservative sympathizers with conservative Christian authoritarianism in Russia. Quite a strange phenomenon, but it's nowhere near as important as what you found in the 1920s and 30s with regard to the sympathies there with either fascism or communism in many Western countries. So let us turn to these expansionist campaigns we have, because all three rogue states expanded in bouts. You had France, you had Japan attacking Manchuria in 1933, occupying parts of China from 1937, and then of course attacking the United States in 1941, the famous attack on Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, Mussolini tried to recreate the Mediterranean as the Roman Sea, the Mare Nostrum, with a number of colonies it already had, and trying to extend them by occupying temporarily Corfu. Then in the 1930s, invading Ethiopia, making the Italian king the emperor of Ethiopia. And in 1939, when Germany took action in Poland, Mussolini invaded Albania. The Emperor Haile Selassie made an absolutely moving plea in the League of Nations, but it was not heard by many at the time, in the sense it was not listened to by many at the time. And he said that this was all about collective security. This is why he was making the plea to the League of Nations to support his country. He thought that it was the very existence of the League of Nations which was at stake. It is the confidence that each state is to place in international treaties. It is the value of promises made to small states that their integrity and their independence shall be respected and ensured. It is the principle of the equality of states on the one hand, otherwise the obligation laid upon small powers to accept the bonds of vassalage. In a word, it is the international morality that is at stake, he said, and have the signatures appended to a treaty value only insofar as the signatory powers have a personal, direct and immediate interest involved. But in fact, nobody came to the aid of Ethiopia. It was indeed swallowed up by Italy. Hitler moved in the same way, and his moves were so frequent and so successive that one talked about salami tactics in the West. First of all, Germany cast off unilaterally the fetters of the Versailles Treaty, which had constrained its rearmament or had limited it to 100,000 soldiers. It occupied the Rhineland, which you see on the left, the blackened area of Germany there. It then invaded Austria, and the Austrians joined the Reich quite happily. And then, very importantly, this was the Munich Agreement. They managed to get the Sudetenland, which is the area, again, the blackened area on the frontiers of Czechoslovakia, which are all mountainous, which then made it all too easy for Germany to invade Czechoslovakia in the following spring, occupying it in March 1939. And it was only after that that the United Kingdom and France started to believe that this was a repetitive pattern that couldn't be stopped, and gave a guarantee to Poland, which in due course was invaded by Germany in September 1939, very importantly, on the premise that they didn't believe, that Hitler did not believe that the United Kingdom and France would make good their guarantee to Poland against aggression. So very importantly, this repeated pattern of ceding to German transgressions of its treaty obligations resulted in the Western powers ultimately giving a guarantee, but the Germans thinking that the guarantee would not be honored, very importantly. So what were the lessons of the 1930s for post-World War II reconstruction? One important lesson was that the League of Nations, this international organization, did not work without the United States, and you must have it in. So in fact, the United States came around to that as well. And the United Nations that was founded following the League of Nations did in fact have the US as a founding member. The next lesson was that France and the UK alone could not keep three rogue powers in check. Not even at the time, not even when they still had their great empires. The United Kingdom and France alone, even as big imperial powers, were too weak to keep those three rogue states in check. A very important lesson to keep in mind. Then the importance of law-abiding states, i.e. the rules-based international order upholding states, standing together, the solidarity between them, that this was absolutely key and that this had been lacking in the 1930s. So France and the United Kingdom felt that they now had to guarantee each other, bind each other to each other, but that this, at the same time, they realized was not enough to secure Europe, that Europe really, really needed the United States. And then the next lesson that was drawn was that Europe needed to integrate in order to make it impossible for one of them to go to war against each other or any of the other ones, that they needed to find a way permanently to settle quarrels peacefully, and that through integrating with one another, they could reinforce democratic rules-based values, and in fact also help through a single market make each other prosperous. And then with prosperity, there was the great hope that they would be resilient to the temptations of either extreme nationalism, fascism, racism, and on the other hand, to communism, which was still being very much exported by the Soviet Union. So those were the sort of first important lessons of what had gone wrong in the 1920s and 1930s in particular. They were translated into the Dunkirk Treaty between the UK and France. That was this mutual guarantee that I've told you about. Then the need for more countries that were upholding a rules-based international order to stand together. which translated itself into the Brussels Treaty, the Western Union, that was later renamed Western European Union, that was initiated by Britain in close cooperation with France, which then had the United Kingdom and France and the Benelux countries in it initially, and then later recruited more European powers. The British and the French then went to Washington and begged the Americans to come aboard, plus Canada, and then actually Italy as well, and many others that followed over the years. But it's very important that this was you could say, a sphere of influence by invitation. It was the British and the French that begged the Americans to come in and to underpin the Western Union Treaty. On the European integration side, that first big step was to create a European coal and steel community to make it impossible for the various European powers to prepare a war without the others being able to stop it and block it. There was an initiative for a European defense community that failed and founded on the rocks of sovereigntism in France, but still that is an idea that has been somehow ticking in the background ever since. But then on the economic and political side, the European communities were created and then, as you know, built up gradually since 1957 with those treaties of Rome. What lessons are there for the present? The lesson is still there that democracies and the law-abiding states need to stand together and show solidarity. Think about this well, the green, light green, dark green countries, all the sort of green hues are ones that can be seen as democracies. I see that Thailand isn't there. I'm a bit worried about that being qualified as a democracy, but still at the moment. You can tell that they are not necessarily the overwhelming majority in the world, which I think then indicates that it's very important, again, for them to stand together and to support each other. What other lessons are there of the 1930s are there for the present? They are definitely to keep the United States committed to European security, but even as in 1948, 1949, America has never ceased to underscore that it is very, very much in favor of the Europeans to show that they can help themselves to merit United States backing, and that the United States have never, ever in the Cold War period or since being very happy with the arrangement where they felt that the Europeans were a free rider on the defense provisions provided by the United States. And of course, in the context of today and the tilt towards the Indo-Pacific on the part of the United States, one can assume that American resources to be devoted to European security in the future will not necessarily be at the same level as they were at the height of the Cold War, because there are simply, as I said, several theaters requiring their attention. So the assumption, I think, is very, very false that the United States is opposed to strengthening of European defense cooperation amongst Europeans. The idea that was around in the 1990s and that I think was effectively blocked at some stage by Turkey of creating a functioning European pillar of NATO that could have worked on its own, even if the United States didn't have the active involvement in the defense of Europe, but could only provide assets. Is still very much a model that I think has support in Washington, and there is simply a false assumption that it must be either one or the other, namely that either you have are working with NATO or you can increase and enhance European defense cooperation. Then there is another lesson, which is that the European states need to integrate further because each is too weak on its own. Now, we heard at the beginning, and this theme has been broadcast quite a number of times, that the state is back in vengeance. Yes, but that may make sense for the first tier states. It's very difficult for the second tier, let alone the third tier states, to keep up with that. A second tier state on its own, how much can that do? You can do all sorts of things by enhancing your freedom of movement, by being member of lots of different organizations, particularly as Britain was for the many decades between the end of the Second World War and now, when it was at the hinge of, on the one hand, the European integration that had been started by Clement Attlee's and Ernest Bevin's Labour government, of the Commonwealth and of NATO, where it was that one link between all three organizations. Britain was very strong there, but now, of course, it's only in two of those. It's only in NATO and the Commonwealth, and it's lost that important influential position within the European Union. So it'll be interesting to watch how much the UK can do it its own. On the whole, all the other European countries have come to the conclusion that there's quite little they can do entirely on their own, and that they would rather keep within the formality of bigger organizations than to rely on ad hocery on the day. European states also need to integrate further because they need to find ways of reinforcing democratic and rules-based values among some of its newer members who haven't got a long tradition of, shall we say, Western democracy and are drifting towards populism or is disregard for their own legal system, even if they are firmly in the NATO camp, even when and if, as and if they are firmly in the NATO camp, which is not necessarily the case for all of these in this strange new situation where some are tending towards the appeasement of their big neighbor in the East. And also a call for the European Union to develop real political weight in world politics that is in some way proportional to its economic performance, because that continues to be the case that the European Union does not have that weight. And there's been a call to make, and there's a continuing call, there has been throughout the entire Cold War, that it would be desirable to make European defense more effective by avoiding duplication, by streamlining it, and not just having patchy bits of cooperation here and there. So far for the comparisons with the 1930s, let me turn to the concern that must have arisen in all of your minds, because you will say, yeah, but isn't there any fundamental difference between now and the 1930s? Absolutely hugely fundamental difference about nuclear weapons. Well, what one can say there is that one can turn to the formula that was produced first by the French strategist Pierre-Marie Gallois, who advised Charles de Gaulle, which is the deterrence as a function of terror and credibility. Now, nuclear weapons are no doubt the most terrifying thing that you have around, but the credibility that one would use them and resort to their use has always been a big problem ever since the Soviet Union and now Russia could retaliate in kind. So the question is, how can one create deterrence? How can one strengthen deterrence? Is there not another way in which one can strengthen that? And the big question is therefore what one can do in terms of the weapons and forces that are more likely to be useful, i.e. can one rely more on forces that will credibly threaten, that one can credibly threaten to use, and that would be conventional forces of all sorts. So in the deterrence equation, there is a lot of importance, and there should be a lot of stress in finding alternatives to nuclear use that could be credibly used and that could be used in discussion. Credibility is a function of solidarity, of determination, and it has to be something that is there throughout the NATO alliance that we're now talking about and its partners, and in fact has to be found in each body politic so that there can be consensus and that this consensus can be strongly demonstrated. So nuclear weapons, I think, in the current situation are more latent than they had been in the Cold War, where the alignment was clearer and the issues at stake were clearer. A Soviet direct invasion or Warsaw Pact direct invasion of NATO territory would have triggered Article 5 in some form. But now we're dealing with situations which are not directly involving North Atlantic Treaty members. So in this context, the whole nuclear issue is there. One can hope will keep a lid on escalation, always presents a danger of escalation, hopefully results in caution on all sides. But in order to deter action, one needs to rely on things other than nuclear weapons, because the credibility that they would be brought into use, at least in any early stage of a conflict, is very much more limited than it would have been in the Cold War scenarios. So far, my lessons from the past And I will hand over now to the moderators with thanks for your attention.
Professor Beatrice, thank you very much indeed for framing the first part of our seminar. I should have said at the very beginning in my introduction that, that we are inviting comments as you wish to add them. I will be tracking comments, and then at the end we've allowed 15 to 20 minutes or so to allow you to pose your questions to either myself, to Professor Beatrice, or to Damian. So can I just encourage that you do that, or bring them forward at the presentation. So without further ado, let me turn it to Damian and to ask and invite him to give a reflection from an industry perspective, but blended as well with his previous military background and experience. So Damian, if I may, I'll turn it over to you.
General Simon, thank you. Russ, just do a quick sound check, please.
Yeah, you're all good.
Great. And if you're able to pop the slides up, Russ, that'll be really helpful. So just while awaiting the slides, yeah, thanks, General Simon, for the kind words of introduction. And Professor Beatrice, you know, a great look back over 90+ years and reflect on, you know, what that means going forwards. And as General Simon said, what I'm going to do is really offer some thoughts from my 30 years of being inside defence, outside defence, in industry, working within the supply chain, within the support chain, and offer a few reflections on how I think we can do things better. Thanks, Russ. So if we can just pop that up to large slide, please, Russ, on the screen. What I'm going to do is look at this in 3 parts. Firstly, I'm going to offer a view on what we as a corporation within Leidos are doing to gear ourselves and position ourselves for this brave new world in which we find ourselves. I'm then going to drop into talk about 4 specific clients that we have within the UK business, and just give a little vignette of what we're doing with them, what those clients think is important, and hopefully draw some thoughts out for you on, you know, what that means for you within the Army, within Defence, within the RLC, and the sort of things that other clients that are thinking about national security and other challenges are looking at. And then finally, I'm going to drill down into defence and talk about the strategic base and its importance, and offer through 4 particular windows some thoughts and maybe challenges, and hopefully things for you to practically take away. I will, you know, try and leave you all with some thoughts, but really what would be great is if on the back of this talk, you know, there was something that resonated with each of you individually, that you took away and applied into your daily role. So with that in mind, next slide, please, Russ. So that's really the scope I just talked about. So we can jump to the next chart, please, Russ. Thank you. So Leidos may not be known to many of you, and this isn't a company brief as such, but what I wanted to do first was just frame how we're seeing the world and what we think is important to enable us to succeed, you know, in a very competitive, challenging environment. Whether you think politically or economically, you know, we face similar challenges that the professors outlined, you know, a great historical look back on, and General Simon has talked about, you know, in the introductory remarks under some of CDS's thoughts. And when I put this together, I thought, actually, you know, I could tell you about the different clients, how we're structured internally. But what I thought I'd really do is just pick apart for a couple of minutes our mission, vision, and values statement, because I think within it, it touches on some of the key tenets of how we as a company are geared and acting to the challenges of today. And the first, really, in the mission statement is the use of technology. we're a science and engineering technology company, but it's absolutely technology is at the heart of overcoming today's challenges and some of the inefficiencies we see in the world. We do that, applying that with many customers, but also internally within our own structures and governance. But the second pillar is our people. So if you look at the vision and the second sentence in the vision, it's about leveraging, using, getting the absolute best from our fantastically diverse population. And I've been in organisations in the past and reflect on when you get to the end of a brief and the final line is, oh, and of course people are our most important asset, and it feels a bit empty. And I can say certainly in Leidos we're very much the opposite. Diversity and inclusion, the value of people is critical to what we do, and that's why it's so key to us as a company, and how we're facing today's challenges. And then of course through the wider social agenda, we're very aware of the challenges that are out there, and think that only by looking at things like sustainable operations and volunteering and being part of the community do we really have the effect we want to. And the final bit on this slide is on values, and it's interesting, integrity and commitment, I'm going left and right on the slide, I think are two of the Army core values, unless they've changed recently. Listening to the professor and about what kept us out of trouble in the 30s and beyond, that inclusion and collaboration, in that case between states, but in our company's case, it's about how we operate. And then our final two values, innovation and agility, which I think are things worthy of reflection for defence, in terms of how we deal with some of the challenges and how you deal with some of the challenges. And so I think I could spend longer on this chart. I'm not going to, but really it's about the use of technology, getting the absolute most from our diverse population, of which 20+% have previously served in the military. So we're a big employer of ex-regulars, ex-reservists. But then through core values, and we put this absolutely at the heart of what we do internally in our structures and externally with our clients. So that just gives you a flavour really for us as a company. So next chart, please, Russ. So 4 examples of the work we're doing with clients, and I don't know how you learn or how you take on information. I learned from my days back in the Defence College of Logistics some 15+ years ago that for me it's a combination of pictures, voice and words, and so I've put all 3 together in this deck for you, so hopefully it'll resonate. But this first example, Subsea 7, it's some really clever technology where we've been able to help send underwater vehicles, effectively think of remote piloted vehicles, but underwater, non-piloted, down to subsurface, looking at things like pipelines, doing inspections. We can send data back up to collection assets near instantaneously, and then that can be put in the hands of the decision makers to enable really rapid decision cycle. It takes people out of the equation, and in terms of the outcomes, and they're on the slide, but just pick a few out. This is about reducing people where to do so exploits technology and makes things more efficient. It's about a much more rapid turn of data processing. So in the past, where we might be relying on a diver to go and do an inspection and come back and fill in a manual form, this speeds up that data transfer massively. It reduces risk in terms of taking people out of harm's way. Hits some really key important, I think, social commitments that we and other organisations have now around things like fleet utilisation, optimisation, which of course has a commensurate reduction in things like environmental impact and emissions. But I think the key bit I just leave on this one, it's about near real-time decision support. So put this in the context of a military commander. It's about the data at his or her fingertips in order to make the decisions, in an agile way. So that's the first example. Next slide, please, Russ. Second example I want to just look at is our home office biometrics work. So we're dealing with Hob, looking to transform their biometrics platform. I'll pull out a couple of different things in each of these 4 vignettes just to give you a flavour of the commonalities as well as the differences. But this is a long-term, high-value contract, and that's important because we think that long-term partnerships are important. What Leidos is not is a sort of transactional service provider or selling a particular product. It gets into long, complex, transformational relationships because we believe that's the way to counter some of the challenges that we face in the brave new world, and our clients think likewise. So it's a long-term contract, high value, and this is about the transformation of biometric systems and helping fuse between some of those different entities of law enforcement, immigration, border security, and it's taking it to the cloud. So again, something you'll reflect on, I'm sure, and this is a direction of travel, I think, within defence. It's about leveraging the power of cloud computing in order to speed up our decision cycle and speed up our use of systems and use of data. And those are the sort of commonalities that come out of HOB. So next chart, please, Russ. So the third of 4 examples, digital services at the border. This is where we're helping Border Force transform the way that border controls are maintained. Clearly critical in today's environment, whether it's from migrant populations or other challenges. And in this, we're providing second and third line 24/7 support in support of critical applications. And if you think about that, turn that into words that you'll have heard in the opening remarks from General Simon. It's about resilience. It's about the ability to continually be operating and not sort of face challenges in terms of timeliness of response. So absolutely critical to this customer is 24/7 support. It's about using data. It's about getting data into the hands of in hands of decision makers. And like I could have mentioned on the previous example, like HOB, it's about removing legacy systems. So again, another example where in a security dimension, what our clients are thinking about are resilience, speed of response, decision making in a timely and agile manner. Next slide, please, Russ. So the last example is our work with the Metropolitan Police. So we're helping the Met upgrade and transform its command and control system. Like previous examples, long-term, high-value contract, and you'll understand why that's important, given what I've said before. And this is fundamentally about a brand new system enabling not only the deployment of personnel to incidents and areas of need, but the agile control of those, right place, right time, key things that you as professional logisticians will absolutely understand, and transforming systems. And if there's a sort of thread throughout some of these that I've not pulled out under each example, it's, the government departments very much have old and antiquated legacy systems. They've not always been an area for investment, and somewhere where we think is really important is to bring in new technology and bring in cloud technology to enable us to basically outpace any would-be adversary as we face the challenges of today. So next chart, please, Ross. So if we've looked at some of the Leidos corporate context and then 4 specific UK examples that hopefully have given you a few thoughts of what different clients are thinking about in this challenging new world. I'm going to focus now on the strategic base. And what I mean by the strategic base, and there are doctrinal definitions out there, but you will have all worked in, for those that are still serving, in part of the strategic base. We're talking about the UK base, barracks, preparation of equipment. We're talking about key nodes like airports of embarkation, seaports of embarkation. The ability to get out, not just UK, other overseas bases, but the ability to project, and then the ability to sustain from the strategic base. And for me, the reason I want to focus on this in the sort of second half of this talk is it is absolutely critical to success in any military operation. And I'll explain why as I go through. But if we just think about the context of the strategic base, I mentioned before that all government departments, it's not just defence, has faced financial challenge for as long as I served, and that will forever be the case, I'm sure. And so defence is no different. It faces financial pressures. The equipment programme has always been unaffordable, so we can't have everything we want in hardware terms. And that pressure is only going to be exacerbated through things like Brexit and COVID, where understandably, whether it's the National Health Service, education, other departments will be vying for government spend. And so we're going to continue to face financial pressures. And what that has seen in the last at least 10, 15 years is a series of outsourced contracts given to industry that make sense. From a value for money perspective, they make sense. But the problem is there's been a series of federated contracts set over time. So when you step back now and look at the strategic landscape of the strategic base, I've described it here as a Gordian knot. And it's a complex web of contracts that are required to fuse together to operate in an optimal way. So that's context point number one. The second about the industry role, it is fascinating having worn a uniform for 27 years and been out since 2018 now. The role of industry is not, well, there's no one single universally understood role. Whether you look at this through the whole force, that gives a different perspective to looking at industry through different contracts and different lenses. But the understanding of industry's role is still a mixed bag, and that needs fixing, in our opinion, if we're to get the best out of the relationship between industry and defence to face today's challenges. We should ask ourselves, of course, and link this to the Professor's excellent brief about, is the strategic base something to worry about? Is it a centre of gravity? Is it something that we recognise would be a potential target? And I think we can conclude very, very quickly, whether it's through your own lives lived through constant cyber challenges or other activity that happens on UK mainland from would-be actors, the strategic base is clearly seen as a legitimate target, and hence its protection is critical. And that protection therefore needs to extend not just physically but virtually, and it needs to encompass industry, given industry's role. And the final bit of context is, the good news is the challenges have been recognised. I'm sure you've all read the 2020 Defence Support Strategy, but it really neatly unpacks the challenges and what needs to be done to be able to prepare, deploy, sustain, recover, recuperate forces correctly. So next chart, please, Russ. So given the context, I just want to now look through four lenses what I think could be done. And I'm hoping that there'll be something, as I mentioned up the top of the talk, that you can reflect on given your roles. If I was live and in with you as an actual audience, I'd probably ask you for a bit of participation at this point and ask, who thinks they have a role either working with industry, managing industry, or receiving services from industry. And I'd be disappointed if every hand in the room didn't go up, because the simple truth is, in my experience, whether it's as a warfighter at the very front end, or indeed someone managing a contract, everybody is engaged with industry and relies on industry to achieve defence's outcomes now. So this is relevant to each and every one of you, and even those hopefully that have left in industry and part of this brief, hopefully some of this will resonate with you. So the first point is on the playbook. So I remember back in, 2007, when I mentioned before, I was in the Defence College of Logistics, and we were wrestling with the creation of course content for partnering officers, because we knew that this key relationship between industry and defence was something we needed to standardise in terms of how people prepared to partner and how they prepared for that relationship with industry. And it was pretty basic back then. And it's evolved massively. And on the back of 2018, some of you will remember collapse of Carillion, big government service provider. And on the back of that, there was a document, a government, not defence, a government document called the Outsourcing Playbook. And it's been rebranded since, called the Sourcing Playbook. But it's really, really good. And it explains for both industry and defence how good partnerships and relationships and outsourced contracts should be run, whether it's about metrics, behaviours. And like all UK doctrine, and I hate to say this, but I think it's true, we do write genuinely some of the most fantastic policy and strategy. And if only everybody read it and adopted it and adapted it, we'd be a pretty potent force. So I do think there's something in reading and adopting the playbook within defence and standardising some of the relationships between industry and defence. And that's both ways. The second point is on what I've called a user guide. I think in this landscape of outsourced contracts, what we've been left with, whether you're part of the RLC, the barracks, or whether you're a frontline warfighter consuming the services, it's really difficult to understand how it works and what is contracted and what's not, and how you get the best from it. And I think there's both a strategic and a tactical point here, because I do think for the strategic base, we need to better define how it works and how you access the services. But this could even apply to a more local level, at a barracks within a unit, because I find what we'll do. I'll give a couple of silly examples or basic examples in this talk to bring it to life. But classic example is over Christmas domestically. You only need to walk up the road, or certainly my road, to work out which people have read, on what day the waste collection will happen, and whether it's going to be recycling or food, and those that haven't. And those that haven't will generally, have their bins out all week and be moaning about the service because they're never being collected. And it's a silly example, but it makes the point that unless you know what is contracted and your part in it, then it's really difficult to get the best of those services. The third point on coherence, I think because we've built by design an inherently or potentially incoherent set of services, it's really important to cohere them. So looking back through contracts and for new contracts, and I do think there's a role for industry here in a non-partisan, helpful, supportive way, because I do think over time what we've got to do is cohere the many contracts that exist, and I think industry can help. Placements, embeds, and forward deployment. In my experience, whether it's on the far bank and helping the sort of reverse supply chain and then the recuperation back in the UK, or whether it's about key staff embedded in organisations such as DISCOM, or key placements of strategic industry or defence partners on either side of the divide, I think we need to do more of that. Whether that's in local units or at a macro level, the more we work alongside each other, the better we are together. And finally, I'll just wrap this first and fourth sections. I'm both disappointed but encouraged by some of what I've seen in the last few years. I do think it's time to get over the defence view, thinking that industry is just a bunch of contractors there to provide a service and doesn't care. And conversely, the industry is looking in and saying, well, defence doesn't have any commercial acumen and they just don't understand. Got to move beyond that. It's time to get beyond the culture clash and move into what I would describe as a contemporary collaborative era. So next chart, please, Russ. So data. Now, I know at this point, General Simon will be hoping I mention a certain 18th century strategist, but I won't, because he's already been mentioned. But if you go back to the 18th century, when some really wise individuals were writing about some of the challenges of what was modern warfare then, they absolutely understood the value of information. And today we have more data than we know what to do with, and we have more data than we know we've got. And the problem is a lot of that data is embedded in different outsourced contracts that are either genuinely protected or perceived to be protected because of commercial sensitivities. And so we haven't been able to aggregate that data, but it's absolutely critical that we do. So much more needs to be done to use the data we've got, collate it, aggregate it. And this goes a lot further, I think, than just simply, turning our hands, as it were, to using data we've got to really invest in some of the skills. So be that data scientists, we've got to think about a different link, I think, between some of what we would have traditionally thought of as the G5, the G4, the G6, and just think about how do we bring data science into our modern way of operating. And I think that's really pertinent to something like the Royal Logistic Corps. Moving up a level, I think there's a requirement here from an industry perspective to offer a view. I think in every major operation I've been involved in, and I'm sure it's the same for many of you that either have deployed overseas or supported from the home base, industry has to be part of the team. You know, there's no major campaign that I've been involved in where industry hasn't been involved, be that in strategic lift or some other support. But what we have faced is a difficulty of getting industry into the planning at the earliest day. And if you think about it, every day industry is dealing with some of the challenges that you'll recognise and indeed have responded to. So be that HGV driver shortages, container shortages, blockages in surface, shipping lanes, container parks, cost of shipping. Industry tracks this on an hour-by-hour basis. And so it's really important to get industry partners in the tent and involved at the earliest stage of planning, because what we don't want to do in this brave new world when the red button is pressed to go is find it's not connected to anything, because with the reliance and assumptions we made around industry support just aren't there. And that leads neatly into the third point. It's worth testing, therefore, that when the red button is pressed, that the commercial freedoms are in place so that we can act and respond with the agility required. What we don't want to be doing is going and seeking sort of commercial freedoms and getting financial sign-off at a point when actually we need to react when we need to react. So it's really important in the use of data and strategic insight to be ready to act. Next chart, please, Russ. So jumping to commercial. So although I've talked about the trend of outsourcing and seeing industry take on more, which I think will continue, it's really important as defence evolves and relets contracts and lets new ones, that it thinks about what it's outsourcing and just make sure that it's not outsourcing any critical skills it will never get back. So it's an obvious thing to say, but it's an important thing to think about the balance. And as warfare changes and as requirements change, and there's more focus on things like technology, need to think about some of the key skills that are needed in this brave new era to maintain in uniform as opposed to outsource. My second point is on coherence and adaptations. I go back to my example of outsourced contracts, and the challenge is in the grey zones. And what I mean by that, if I give you a practical example, if you're building a house and you've outsourced the groundworks, the building, the plumbing, the electrics, carpentry and everything directly, what I'd suggest you'd probably find is that not that individually they don't do what you've required, but where they're required to link, there might be some challenges because you may not have set within their specific contracts how they were to link together. And I think this is somewhere where in the strategic based defence needs to have a good look and study some of those grey areas, study some of those gaps and think about the different to industry or defence to industry relationships to enable that coherence. And the third point on commercial arrangements is just about speed. It's really important that if we need to change a relationship between industry and defence in order to respond to some of the challenges of the IR or new ways, the integrated operating concept, it can't take 2 years. The process of contract change at the moment is too slow on both sides. We need to think about how we innovate within a contract and how contracts are built to enable rapid change. And it plays to General Simon's two cogs, really. Yes, it's fine to have a BAU angle, but when you need to turn the dial up to 10 and say we need to be agile, you can't wait 2 years for that to be processed and resolved. Next chart, please, Russ. So, risk. Outsourcing brings risk, and industry is as used to risk management as defence is. It's a really important part of any governance of an organisation. and industry's happy to hold risk, but really important to recognise, and for all of us to keep in our minds, that it's impossible to outsource military risk. Think about Carillion, I've already mentioned, but it's absolutely imperative that defence understands its risks and what it's outsourced, because although it might lead to failure of an organisation, in the case of Carillion, military failure and UK failure in terms of achieving a defence ambition, that's a defence requirement, and that sits on the shoulders of those squarely commanding and running those operations. So being really, really careful about what's been outsourced and the risks around it is critical. What I've seen is in isolation, risk processes are great. So within defence, whatever tool you're using, we've got some excellent mechanisms and processes, likewise in industry. But where it gets a bit challenging, again, is in the joins. So we can often end up with a situation where risks are being studied, transferred between organisations, held by one organisation because another one can't or won't do something, and they'll accept and tolerate the issue. But as I've mentioned before, they can end up in catastrophic failures, and that's something that if we need an optimised and an agile strategic base, we can't afford to carry those sorts of strategic risks. So they've really got to be studied. And again, it's in the grey zones between contracts as much as it is within contracts. I think that's where the challenge is. General Simon's talked about this slightly. So what else do we do to minimise risk? Well, clearly we're in an era now within supply chains of onshoring, nearshoring. It's fine relying on a product coming from a country thousands of miles away when you can assure its provision, but when the facility is turned over to production of masks or ventilators without any warning by the government of the country from which you're buying, you are stuck. So we've got to think about resilience on a nearshoring. We've got to think about small and medium enterprises and how are those brought in to add more resilience to product provision. And we've got to really think about and test contingencies to make sure that they work. And I know Defence is doing that as part of its sort of agile series of events, but it's really, really important that it's tested properly. Next slide, please, Russ. Cyber, crikey, you could spend a 30-minute brief and not scratch the surface on cyber, but clearly this threat of cyber is massive, and we've got to really think about how inside the tent industry is also thinking about things like Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus. We've got to think about modern agendas like Net Zero 50 and prioritise what's important for defence. We've got to think about how that trade-off works between cost and other outcomes. And finally, on risk, I think we just need to think more about opportunities, because if we only ever think through the treat, tolerate, sort of terminate framework, we're probably missing the opportunity. So I think we need to think about, between industry and defence, what is it we could do and how would it help, as opposed to just thinking about managing down the problems that we look at. So last chart, please, Russ. So bringing it all together in conclusion, if you can just go to the next slide, please, Russ. Thank you. So I've told you about Leidos. It's about technology. It's about its people. It's about genuinely about our values, putting things like ESG at the heart of what we do, both internally and with our clients. All of our clients are focused on things like efficiency, getting to cloud, speed, agility, partnerships, and getting data in the hands of commanders that can make decisions. And I think in the strategic base, I'd just say that through, again, four simple windows, we need to collaborate better, collaborate more. We've got to really get into the data. We've got to understand the gaps in contracts and how they work together. And we've got to think a bit more, not just about risk, but about opportunities. I have written a piece, that picture there that you can see on that slide is something I've knocked up recently, and I'll be sending that out probably next week. Be available for anyone that would like a copy. Please let that be known through the RLC Foundation, and I'll make sure you see it. General Simon, that's me. I'll hand back over to you.
So Damian, thank you very much indeed. So I've been prompting and encouraging questions, and now they're flooding in and I'm being overwhelmed by them all. So I shall attempt to read them. But look, let me thank our two presenters, first of all, to Professor Beatrice and to Damian, a really good juxtaposed set of understandings and an analysis. You know, the historical brought into the contemporary, and then Damian looking at this very much from an industry perspective and a corporate Leidos view, and very much holding a reflective mirror in many ways up to the challenges that defence faces. There are some good questions now coming in. Let me have a go at just introducing some. Professor Beatrice, the first question that came in is quite a long one. I'm going to come to you in a minute to answer that. I'm assuming you can see it, but if you can't, I'll read it out. But to the second question first, which is posed to me from AMRCO9. AMR, you wanted to challenge the notion or my hypothesis up front that resilience costs and can therefore or may result in lower profits, poorer overall performance in peacetime. And your counterpoint, which I agree with, frankly, is that there is a case where innovation can indeed achieve resilient, redundant outcomes without necessarily it having to cost more. And I think that is right. I was talking in general terms, but let me just explain why I said what I did, and also dock with your point. As it stands, and as many will know, the Defence Security Public Contracts Regulations, the DSPCR, pretty much only allow us to contract on the basis of the quality of the product and the price, and they are two legs of the equation. My contention is there should increasingly be a third, and in order to prioritise resilience as an outcome, it may, particularly at the moment, and in the way that our contracts are set and incentivised, it may well cost us more. I do think, though, if we are to take Damian's challenge around, cohering contracts and future-proofing them for the brave new world, I think there is a way that we can achieve the right levels of incentivisation such that we get resilient outcomes that don't necessarily cost more. But until the demand is there for resilient outcomes, it may be that we do have to pay more, particularly if that means that we seek to nearshore or onshore some of our sources of manufacture. And just to close the point, the way that the LCST program is incentivized as it stands, so every time Team Leidos as our managing agent recompetes a contract for services, it is incentivized to attain the lowest price and the minimum viable product, and it earns a gain share on the price differential between the price of the contract as was and the recompeted contract. So even if we as a customer were to specify a more resilient outcome, which meant that the cost of manufacture increases because we brought it closer ashore, then Leidos would de facto earn less in gain share. And so we need to think about a contracted mechanism that rewards them for the innovative time that they may have to spend and expend to go and find a solution that gives us resilience without necessarily compromising on cost. So Emma, do come back to me. I agree the point, and I was talking in general terms, but I see constraints as they stand that do preclude. Let me turn to Professor Heuser. Professor, can you see that first question? It's quite a long one.
I can actually. I don't think I have it. I think it's not. It wasn't written to everybody.
Okay.
I have is one on resilience and on economics.
Okay. Well, look, the person that posed the first question, it was a DM straight to me. Rather than read it all, I'll invite you to send it to all, and we'll pick it up.
Can I weigh in and add my question, General Simon, to yours that you've just put to Damon Alexander? If the most important criteria for contracts is the quality and the price, General Simon has now added resilience. But should it not be, in addition to that, also the trustworthiness of the source, the question of whether one is by that doing terrible things to the environment, the question of whether in the process of outsourcing and procuring from another country somewhere, one is opening the door to some backdoor of influence by a potential adversary that can be brought upon the product itself.
So you're right. The DSP is around the due diligence around trafficking and the like. So there is provision within that to ensure that we're not contracting with nefarious entities. What I would add in addition, which I think COVID has shown us, is that we didn't understand the extent of the dependencies within the tiers of our supply chain. We tended to default to a relationship with the upper tiers and not understand the subordinate tiers below that. What we have done and what we are doing is pursuing a piece of work that is trying to illuminate the lower tiers of supply chain dependency. We've changed the DEFCONs, which now put onus on the upper prime to understand and provide us data and information on the sources, the points of manufacture and the sourcing origins of the critical spares, including the raw materials and composite raw materials that sum and aggregate to become the spare or the commodity that we actually employ. And we've got a supply chain intelligence capability that's about to stand up in a couple of months and it's going to be competed. So I can't predetermine which platform we might adopt. And there is a number of commercially available platforms that do this, but they use machine learning and open source data to build an understanding of the networks and interdependencies of global supply chains, which we will then fuse and incorporate the data and information we get from our suppliers to build a common operating picture and to provide an upstream understanding of the global interdependencies of those supply chain networks. So we're absolutely getting there. We're not there yet, but we're close, and we recognize that we must. Let me turn to another question, if I may. Thank you. I'm just scrolling the questions now. I'm just going to turn to one that Brigadier Lee has posed. Brigadier Lee says, my thesis is the defence needs to be bolder in outsourcing entire value chains rather than parts of the chain where inefficiencies are pushed up or downstream. So Lee, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think what I would want to say here and publicly to industry and to the wider core is that defence has not articulated its value proposition in terms of what it wants its supply chain, probably for over 10 years. We've got a piece of work that is kicked off with Deloitte in support that is going to help us determine what we want from our value and the balance between cost efficiency, performance and resilience, and to a degree sustainability going forward. And to the extent that perhaps presided by design over the fragmentation of that base, which in itself has caused pockets of inefficiency when you take an aggregate view. I think there is a lot of merit in Lee's thesis, and therefore it is something that we will consider once we determine what the value chain's outcome is that we want from our supply chain. Then the route to market and how the extent to which we should outsource the services and the capabilities we need, or ask ourselves, what part of the brain function do we need to keep inside the MOD as an intelligent integrator? But these are quite profound questions, and Brigadier Lee and I are very much on the boundaries of this now. Yeah, Professor, thank you. I've got a question from industry. Well, this one's from Simon Wilton, who's at Unipart. And Damon, I'll ask you to come on the back of the answer that I offer. And it touches to some of the points I think Damian was making. But Simon asks what practical steps are being taken to develop greater collaboration with defence and industry, particularly out with major procurement programs. That's the first part. And my answer to that, because it is a really good question. Damian talks about this notion of temporary collaboration thing. And I think I absolutely buy that. It's important. that we both build trust and relationships such that we know that we can pull down on them to get the speed response that we need, particularly if there's a dependency with industry to achieve. And one of the ways to do that, and we're absolutely doing this in our second year functional plan, is build a common operating portal with data that we can share with industry, such that we can see each other's data through the common operating portal. Now, again, many may not be aware, a support data warehouse from the old enterprise data, where we have brought much more of our information data, support data, to a central place. And there's work that's going on now to clean that data, to curate it, and to make it more accessible, with the aim ultimately taking it to the mod cloud at the end of the year. And as I say, as part of that, I think it is about the data sharing and the trust that is engendered through the sharing and the common interpretation of that data. So that's one of the practical things, Wilton, that we're committed to doing. The other I would offer is around behaviours, and Damian's challenge around the sourcing playbook should be our user guide. And Damian and I both were on a journey of strategic partnering and resetting of the LC contract. And the first step was to sign a mutual contract of consent. But it needs, and you will see shortly a set of defence support values that CGLS is actively promoting, and he's been talking to industry about them. And indeed, we soft launched them at the DSEI last year. So you will absolutely see more of this. And ultimately, you need to see it tangibly brought into the way that we discourse and have discussions and relationships between our parties. Damon, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. So I think good to see Simon Wilton online. So it's a bit like the I use inclusion as a comparative, if I might. You know, if you in an organisation, if you think that inclusion is solved by, you know, writing it at the top of your headed paper and saying we're now inclusive, it's clearly not that easy, and it's a journey of years, and it's hard. And so to Simon Wilton's points, I think it's everything he says, from training and education and role preparation and placements, and it needs a continued commitment and a renewed, I think, refreshed commitment from both industry and defence, and it's a journey, and it will take time. But I think only by doing all those things and more, back to the playbook, as you mentioned, back to using fora such as, you know, the many industry fora that exist, but I'm well aware that some companies might not be represented there because they don't necessarily have government business. You know, it's all of the above. So it's a journey, I would say, as opposed to, you know, try and do a quick fix. But first comes the commitment to do it. And if you get the commitment to do it on both sides and everyone's up for it, then I think you've got a chance of progress and, you know, making inroads.
That's right. And Professor, is there anything you wanted to add to that point?
I would rather add to yours, because you very interestingly talked about this data sharing and creating trust through that. Isn't every sharing always also a source of vulnerability? How do you deal with that? How do you weigh the sharing of data and the trust building with then opening yourself up to vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, you know, I won't give this the answer it deserves, I guess, but in part it's how we filter and you know, and what purpose are we seeking in the sharing of data? I mean, clearly it can't be open book. You know, there has to be degrees and protocols put in. So I think you'd have to agree the purpose with which you would seek to share data, and on that basis, I think it would be fair to put certain boundaries and provisions around it to achieve the shared common goals. So it isn't. I didn't want to infer it's an complete open book in that regard, because I don't think that would be helpful. There would be vulnerability. But I think in principle, there's a balance, because at the moment we share almost nothing. And so we've got to find the balance point, I think. I'm going to go to another question on my little screen. It's Scammell. Mike says contractors proved to be extremely resilient in Afghanistan, Iraq, but NRF or GEF deployment, near peer conflicts, contested logistics will present a different set of risks. Where do the panel think the forward line of contracting ought to be? Damian, I think I might turn that one to you in the first instance. What would Team Leidos's view be, given the forward line of enemies, as Mike Scammell defines it, could be?
Yeah. Let me give you a Damian view as opposed to a Team Leidos view. I think the two are probably subtly different, because I'm really trying to think about my experience, like Mike has probably had, being out in Afghanistan and many other places where I think contracted support has been excellent, and they have put themselves, in the front line. Whether it's think about fuel supplies for Afghanistan, think about some of the other on-base supports in the non-FOBs. I think Mike, it's flexible. I think if we think about it as a graphic, with a line in a classic first line, second line, old war model, I think we've got it wrong. I think with appropriate understanding of the risks being taken, I don't think industry, and again, this is a Damian view, I don't think there is a forward line, certainly in the supply chain, that's too far forward. So do I mean by that I could see an industry, embed in an RLC forward formation? Why not? Because, my experience, particularly in the reverse supply chain and in recuperation, and I think if we're to meet the needs of agility and persistence that General Simon talked about up front, we need to be doing far more to sweat the reverse supply chain and remediate equipment than we do today. I don't think we do it as well as we could. And I think industry has a role. So I think it depends. It could be as near shore as the UK, because that's where cyber threats sit, and it could be as far forward as we've got the innovative ambition to think about.
Thank you, Damian. Professor, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, if you didn't recognize my shaking of head.
On a different screen. I'm only looking at the question screen.
Yes.
So look, I agree with Damian, Mike, actually. I think that, and it goes back to the engendered trust, and trust is ensuring that we share as much as we know about the environment and the threat, such that we're not obscuring any aspect of that threat and how it might manifest from our industry partners, such that they can do their own risk to whether their own duty allow their people alongside us. I think that we do share as much as we know, and there is that trust and honesty. Then as Damian said, I think that we will see our partners in all guises as far forward as is needed. Examples of Iraq and Afghanistan do demonstrate the notion that to pack their bags at the first sign of an IDF just wasn't the case. So that's my thought on that. Let me turn to a question for Professor Beatrice, if I may. That is, are Western domestic policies overriding the to undertake significant Afghanistan? Has Afghanistan become too toxic? Is there a case for a US military management?
Yes, as I've already dashed into the answer there, of course we are seeing intervention fatigue, but I think that is in part because everybody goes on and on about our big failures and doesn't talk about smaller successes that are actually quite poignant. For example, there is a wonderful book out with Macmillan right now by Armel Diroux on a French intervention in Central African Republic, in which she quite plausibly argues that very, very limited French intervention managed to stop rebel forces from rounding up and killing 10,000 civilians, because there were European forces there at the time. And the same, you say, people are constantly criticizing the various international efforts in Mali, but without the interventions in Mali, you probably have an Islamist state there right now. So there's actually been quite a lot of cases where we have intervened in a positive way and have had some limited, but sometimes even more lasting success and concentrating exclusively on the big failure now of Afghanistan, I think is very unhelpful. That was a particular configuration. We can go on and on about why that one resulted in what it has resulted in, but it is not totally, it's not the whole story. There are many other things. And the one thing that we can't do, I'm sorry, I'm one of those who say that you cannot stand aside when a crime is being committed. This is the one thing that is the lesson of the Third Reich and the Second World War, that there is a universal obligation to intervene when genocide is being carried out. And that's something that we can't let go. This is part of our identity and our value that we need to uphold.
I 100% concur. So, colleagues, final question, draw things to a close. And it's quite a precedent question, I think, from Mark Catherwood. Mark says, we often discuss improvements to NATO interoperability. Would our resilience and readiness be better improved if we pivoted more towards commercial interoperability and interface? Damon, if you could just offer your views on this as you can, please.
Just you broke up slightly on the question. I'll read it if it's in the chat box, just so I missed a couple of the key points, I think. Which can just remind me which was the question?
It is. It's Mark Catherwood's. It's about NATO interoperability. Would resilience and readiness be better improved if we pivoted our commercial logistics more towards a NATO interoperability space?
Oh yes, great question. I know there are many other good questions on here that I know we haven't had a chance to get to. I think so this is complicated, right? For years, if you're within NATO and have worked in NATO, and I'm sure many of you have, you realise just how capable an organisation it is, and that capability that comes from collective defence and ability is amazing. On the other hand, you then realise if you try and implement something in NATO, and I go back some years and use an old Adams, you probably will have used Adams in the past, some of you, where you're trying to use, the Allied deployment tool, where if we're lucky, we get one person in Northwood trained on it, and I'm going back a decade or so, but to make the point, rolling out logistics interoperability is a lot harder than it sounds. And we've shifted, right? Because I go back to when I was in Kosovo, and Kosovo was about, at the time, logistics was a national responsibility. And I think we've moved, quite rightly towards more reliance and interoperability. And there are some great examples, like you've put about standard things, for movements is a great example. But it's tough, right? And you've got to sometimes move at the speed of either the nation that takes its most time, or indeed you end up driving the agenda. And there's myriad NATO committees which you will know about, and General Simon will know about, that look at some of these things. So I think we should not lose sight of how NATO can help. I come back to my opportunities. So rather than thinking about when we do our wargaming of the strat base, how do we treat some of the things that we face as problems? If we think differently, and NATO's a great example, in a different dimension, how could we do this differently through NATO, through maybe Five Eyes, or other entities? Then certainly I think it could probably help resilience and readiness. But it's not a simple thing, but it's a great question.
We very much enjoyed the questions, and that there is plenty more that we could discuss. People are probably very welcome to get in touch with us respectively. I haven't been able to find you, Damian, on the internet, but I'm very easy to find. So if anybody has any historical boring questions for an old historian, do come back to me and send me an email. But thank you very much for having had us with you today. And thank you for this session. I shall simply assume that it's now the end of this session. So thank you very much, everybody, for having joined us.
Yeah, let me just add to your words, if I might. Really, really great. I mean, the questions are always the most fun bit of these things, but you've got to brief up front to get there. I know there were some questions around supply chain that were thrown my way. Let me just do a quick 10-second answer if I can. So to Private Matthew, auditing and Carillion, I'd look at banking legislation and regulation, but you've got to be really careful when you get into imposing massive governance over organisations that you limit their agility. That's where I'd go first, thinking about Carillion and auditing. There was a good question from Amar about resilience and multiple sources. And what I'd say, Amar, to your question, it was about buying power. Really, no. What you've got in various contracts is buying power and leverage. What defence has got to do is define its requirements and then enable organisations to go away and leverage its buying power. Defence already has thousands of suppliers that are engaged through contracts like the LCSC contract, and that can be expanded. And it's just about making the priority, setting the priority. If there's any other questions, the same as the Professor said, very happy to talk to you offline. And I think, Professor, we're back in the firing line next week in another session around agile posture. So for any of you going there, if you didn't get a chance to get your question, then please throw it at us next week. Very much look forward to it.
Yeah,
Here's the
Dave,
General back with us. Great.
just at the wrong moment, I got thrown out, and so I am grateful. Look, so to all participants, and particularly to Beatrice today, thank you very much for kicking us so ably at RLC Symposium for 2026. There's a live feed at the Agile Campaign Plan, opportunity to hear more of the academic input to the challenges that we face, and then more on the stand. So you're more than welcome, anyone here, to come and join that. So thank you all, and we'll see you more at the Foundation for events in the coming months.